these trees sway like one single blob in Disney's Chicken Little, compare that to this tree in Encanto, where each individual leaf moves realistically on its own. In fact, zoom out on Chicken Little and you'll see just how little detail is in the background compared to Disney's newer features. Chicken Little was Disney's first foray into full 3D animation, so the worlds the studio could create were a lot simpler. But animated worlds have evolved a lot since 2005, and one film in particular kicked off a whole new era of realistic environments: Tangled.
Tangled really represented to me the film where we achieved the promise of taking the artistry that existed at Disney Animation Studios and apply that to the medium of CG.
To create the world of Tangled, or any 3D animated world, Disney has a dedicated environments team, whose job is to model and develop the movie's backdrop based on the concept designs. The studio then uses software programs to automatically simulate the behavior of world elements like plants, water, and lighting that illuminates it all. To fill up the whimsical forests of Tangled, Disney developed special tree modeling tools to help the environments team lay down the geometry for lots of trees, all with a specific fairy tale look that echoed the flowing shapes of hand-drawn animation and painting. These new tree tools included a program called Skeletor, which let artists hand-model 3D geometry on certain hero trees, like this one that Rapunzel swings from. They also built a new software called Dendro, which let them art direct the growth of the whimsical trees and program the direction and amplitude of wind in the tree's branches and leaves. Dendro also helped calculate how branches should grow according to environmental factors like gravity, light, and natural obstacles. The storybook trees for Frozen were even more stylized than Tangled, inspired by the unusual tree design in Sleeping Beauty. To create these highly specific shapes and branching structures, Disney developed a full vegetation generator to replace Dendro, called Bonsai. With Bonsai, the studio could build a wide library of trees, bushes, plants, and foliage that could be shared and reused across other Disney productions, like Big Hero 6. Bonsai came in handy for animated vegetation like this in the film's setting of San Francisco. The main challenge was its fully urban landscape, which stood apart from the organic environment seen in earlier films, involving many more layers of objects, movement, and above all, lights. Disney needed a way to render complex lighting environments. Luckily, Disney engineers were hard at work on a powerful new renderer called Hyperion, which could produce densely packed scenes with light bouncing around in every direction, handling several million rays at a time. This allowed the team to build a vibrant city, lit in some shots by hundreds of thousands of sources, from street lamps to car headlights.
That was a big leap in terms of complexity, in terms of the number of individual assets that we can actually render in one scene.
It also helped the filmmakers on Moana capture the fanciful sense of scale they wanted. The name of Moana's fictional home means literally Big Island. And thanks to Hyperion, the team could produce sunlit shots of the beach where water simulations with full surface reflections extended a quarter-mile into the distance, and village shots with about 10 times the geometric complexity of San Francisco. The renderer also powered over 100 shots of the monster Te Kā, illuminated by bright streams of lava permeating through massive smoke plumes. To shape the behavior of the molten lava, Disney updated its physically based simulator Matterhorn, originally developed for the snow in Frozen. Disney now expanded this software to handle the more viscous substance of lava, along with other natural island materials like sand, mud, and foam. A scouting trip to Tahiti helped Larry, the head of environments for Moana, determine how each of the film's over 60 species of vegetation should move with the wind.
Every minute, everything was moving, so we knew we had to do that in our movie.
Like the fact that coconut trees' leaflets and boughs should sway with the breeze, while the trunks themselves remain still. For more dramatic vegetation movement in the Te Fiti healing sequence, the effects team created spreading texture maps of plant growth.
You could almost claim that Moana is probably the real progenesis of like when we started to do really complex animated vegetation at the studio.
Of course, the star of this world was water, present in nearly every shot, and in much more complex forms than Disney had ever produced. including waves of all sizes breaking in specific patterns on the sand and reef. So Disney developed a new engine called Splash, which could simulate waves running, crashing, and breaking, and create secondary effects like boat wakes. But while the water in Moana looks warm, crystal clear, and inviting, the Dark Sea in Frozen 2 had to be rough, dark, and stormy to convey the threats facing Elsa as she embarks on her quest.
And I feel like we just continually stand on our own shoulders with the films that come before us. So creating the waves in Frozen 2, that would have been a whole different adventure for us if Moana hadn't come before that.
So the team shot reference footage in parts of the Southern California coast where the waves break especially hard. They then used a set of equations to model the motion of the Dark Sea waves, experimenting with different values for variables like amplitude and ocean floor depth until they got waves that were 3 to 4 times Elsa's size. The artists then added more foam and spindrift mist to capture the rough, churned-up nature of the Dark Sea. But the Dark Sea only marks one stage in Elsa's quest. Most of the film takes place in another entirely new setting, the Enchanted Forest, far from Arendelle. Just as the waves had to tower over Elsa, making her look small, many of the shots in the forest are framed extra wide to emphasize the character's isolation, which also puts more of the world on display. And since the characters spend so much time in this setting, Disney had to take its forest population capabilities up a notch. So it developed a new vegetation placement tool, Droplet. Designed as an interactive brush, Droplet let artists paint down, scale, and reposition vegetation in an art-directed way, giving them control over the flow and style of the forest as a whole. The artists had to paint not only the canopy, but also the ground cover in the saturated colors of autumn, in contrast to the snow-blanketed grounds of the first movie. Luckily, they could use bonsai from Frozen 1 to manipulate the color of the leaves on the forest floor, and make the forest look striking not just in overhead shots, but from every angle.
This forest is beautiful.
Since the snow has melted in Arendelle, the team had to render its buildings in much higher detail, increasing the texture resolution. This visual richness was equally necessary for the Forest Dam, where surface textures helped tell the backstory. The filmmakers decided that King Runard's workers would have to cut the stone from the surrounding fjord walls and assemble each block by hand. To reinforce this idea, artists sculpted in high-level detail little imperfections on all the surfaces, and used texture software to create subtle material variation, like these uniquely rotated cut marks on each block. And to show that 34 years had passed since its construction, artists used Droplet to paint hundreds of thousands of iterations of moss, grass, and mulch. Disney continued to improve that vegetation pipeline for Raya and the Last Dragon. But the major focus was this: the atmospherics of the Southeast Asian settings. These regions tend to be dense with water and moisture, so the environments called for a lot of volume-based elements, like morning mist and ground fog. Traditionally, that work would fall on the effects department. But in Raya, instead of having the effects department create atmospheric elements on a per-shot basis, Disney created these elements in pre-production and put them into an extensive library. Later, as lighting artists were lighting a shot, they could pull from that library and compose the atmospherics into it, without having to request new assets from the effects department every time. This gave the lighters more flexibility over complex atmospheric setups, and more freedom to express the emotional story in each scene. Dust and smoke signified moments of conflict and misgivings, while trusting moments between characters were heavier on water elements like mist and steam. Just as Raya's Southeast Asian setting defined its world elements, Encanto's Colombian setting called for a lush jungle surrounding the Madrigal's village. And this environment had to be in motion, like we'd see more of later on with Strange World, which was in production at the same time as Encanto. Specifically, Isabella's song is brought to life by the whole animated environment, with these flowering plants growing in sync with the music. But that dynamic environment work was done mostly by hand.
Each artist had to go into each and every shot of that sequence, which was a beautiful sequence, and bring in custom rigs that allowed them to do the growth for those plants.
Disney had to figure out a way to do that work in advance for Strange World, which, more than any other Disney animated environment, featured a lot of moving parts. Literally.
Oh, wow. It's beautiful.
Elements like these plants acted as background characters and part of the environment at the same time. To set the whole landscape in motion, the studio created an entirely new role: Animated Environments Supervisor.
That role has me interacting with almost every department in the studio, certainly with the production environments team to ensure that the assets that they're building will be animatable. And then that would move towards effects and character animation to provide animation for those plants, kind of ferrying the moving plants through the whole pipeline, one shot at a time.
Disney also adjusted its pipeline so that Ben's team could fine-tune the environment's movement earlier on in the process.
New to this show was the opportunity to say, that plant right there is moving a little too much, or it's just a little too crazy, to make sure that we were handing off the plants and the environment in its best state before it hit the really render-intensive departments, such as effects and lighting, where things start to get a little bit harder to change. So we would do the growing in advance, and then when shots came, we would place that animation in. So all of the work was front-loaded for Strange World, which allowed us to do many hundreds more shots than Encanto did.
The environments in this movie weren't just dynamic. They were some of the largest ever created at Disney Animation, with some stretching 2.5 miles wide. So large that the team needed to expand its computing power.
At the peak, I think there was a shot with 20 or 30 million blades of alien grass.
To convey the Strange World's vastness, the lighting team made heavy use of atmospheric elements, like those used for Raya, adding clouds and ground fog to create a sense of depth and scale. These expansive sets lent themselves to wider camera lenses. The camera and layout team could use controls to adjust the lens distortion. So whenever they wanted a shot to feel off-kilter and, well, strange, they could dial up the distortion effect, a decision always driven by the story context of the scene. It all comes together with editing, which gives the audience space to take in the environment, and sound design, which helps communicate the character of the space.
Because, it doesn't have a face. It can't communicate that way, but it can communicate through sound. It's squishy, it breathes. I make sure that there's an intentional personality behind every little sound that the plants make as they breathe in or breathe out or undulate.
Now that Disney's built such a powerful tool set for living, breathing worlds, the team has to step it back sometimes, especially since, unlike live-action filmmakers, they're creating these worlds from the ground up.
In feature animation, sort of the sky's the limit, and you can easily put more in than you need. You're looking for that perfect blend of organic, fascinating texture in the background, not so much that it's going to take away from what the characters are doing, what the characters are saying.
After all, Disney builds worlds to service the story, not the other way around. For the same reason, it doesn't stick to any house style for world design, instead tailoring each world to its story needs. Just contrast the details of the castles in Tangled and Frozen.
Rapunzel's tower, the wooden beams, there isn't a straight beam anywhere. Everything's handcrafted, hand-hewn. Everything's got a slight twist and an organic feel to it, riffing off of the design principles that applied to Snow White and Pinocchio. When you look at the interiors of the castle in Frozen, we do have a lot of very straight, rigid line. And that's, of course, all done to support what we're saying about those environments. Oh, this is for royalty. Okay, they were getting the best craftsmen who could make the straightest line. And really, everything needs to go through that level of rigor and discussion.
Those decisions on Strange World struck a balance between making the landscape feel imaginative and unexpected, while retaining the story-first principle that made the classic Disney movies so beloved.